Hey guys, Nick from Woodcraft. I just finished up this horizontal fence. I'm going to do a walkthrough with you, but before I get started on that, I want to give you a quick backstory. These customers originally contacted me back in, April, May of 2022. They sent me an email. I never responded. She sent me a text a couple days later and said, just want to follow up on my email. Never responded. July, got a couple more emails, followed by text messages, never responded. And same thing in October, and then again in November, she emailed me, followed with a text a few days later. And eventually I did respond to the text. And her text message essentially said, "Hi, this is Cindy at XYZ address. I'd really, and she cap locked it, really want to be a new customer. Please respond." So I did respond to that, and I said, "Hey Cindy, I've received all of your emails and your couple dozen texts. It's been a busy year. I figured you'd eventually give up and hire someone else." And she laughed. She's really cool customers, really good sense of humor, very pleasant to work for. But she laughed and she said, to be honest, I did talk to a few other contractors, but I just didn't like what they have to say. I've seen your work. You're the only guy that I want to install this project. So I figured I'd just keep pestering you until eventually you showed up at my house and did some work. And I said, cool, sounds like we might get along. And we have. Met her a few days after that original text message. We're into March now, and just finished up her first project. And overall, very awesome people to work for, but super picky. And they were willing to wait for me and my schedule for almost a year, So all of my videos, I hammer that point, the value of doing quality work. And I assume that my bid is higher than the other guys. I don't know that for a fact, but I would assume so. I would hope so. At the very least, though, regardless of the paycheck, the value of doing quality work is in the job security of having people that are willing to wait for 11 months for you to do work for them, even if you don't respond to them, and give them a glimmer of hope. I did not reply to this lady for almost 8 months, and she was still willing to wait for me to do so. So that in itself has value. Even if my bid is the exact same dollar amount as anyone else, there's something to be said about having people that are willing to wait for you. So I'm gonna stop that rant. Let's get into some process stuff. Before I show you construction techniques and stuff like that, I want to take a quick look at material. I'm going to start with gates, just because it's kind of a one-off and it's a pretty simple concept. We added these stairs recently, so I finished up those last night. Little half panel just to keep their dogs from getting back into that little chase. This is a pretty small opening. So the opening itself is 46. My gate is at 45. Pretty small opening, but I still used a steel post with a steel frame. And not only is it steel, but it's also powder coated. So there's some extra expense there. But over the years, I've learned that wood frame gates just do not hold up very well. And even if they continue to function, they look like crap after a few years. So even on small gates, we're going to do steel. This is the finished material that I'm using, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But steel gates, steel posts. So post spacing on a horizontal fence, a lot of guys are doing 4 foot on center, and they're using picket material, which is 5/8 thickness. So this is the picket, it's 5/8. I don't like that. I've done one installation like that and I did not like it. I just don't think those pickets hold up very well. So I'm using 5/4 decking. My trim is still going to be a picket, but my actual fence material is 5/4 decking. And I kind of want to break that down as to why I'm doing that. My post spacing is 6 foot on center though. So that's one of the advantages with using 5/4 decking versus pickets. I have fewer posts to set. It doesn't look as busy, but it's, in the long run, it's actually stronger. So let me pause this. I'm gonna set up some notes real quick and give you guys a little breakdown on that. Alright, so I got my drawing board set up here. Quick side note though, one of the things that I think, I don't know if it sets my company apart, but it's definitely something that I'm extremely anal about, is not just the quality of work, but the professionalism with your install. Like, my sawhorses are here because I am coming back next week for some more work, but everything that I've completed is cleaned up. Like, there is no trash, there is no anything. And there is a piece up on the patio, which I left up here for the purposes of this video, actually. I noticed it while I was walking around. That's a corner from a stack of lumber. That's mine. That's my responsibility to clean up. This should be common sense, but there's just a lot of guys that, I don't know. There's no excuse for that. Pick up your trash, man. These people are letting you work on their property, and they're paying you a lot of money to do it. So there's really no excuse for that. All right. So, rant over. I'm using the 5/4 decking, like I said. A lot of guys will use picket material, which is 5/8 thickness, and they'll run their posts 4 foot on center. So let's look at a couple issues with that idea. So picket material at 5/8 is kind of like a nominal 2x4. It is a nominal measurement. So this is 5/8 material, quote unquote. But on my tape, I'll slide over an inch so you can actually see the tick marks. There you go. So I'm under 9/16. It's not quite a half inch, but it's definitely under 9/16. So it's not even a full 5/8. It's a nominal 5/8, which is pretty thin material to begin with. But now we're going to make it nominal, and the next thing you know, it'll end up a 1/4 inch. 5/4 decking is a true 1 inch, and it always will be. That's just the way it's labeled from the mill, and they can't sell 5/4 decking if it is not 1 inch. So that is always going to be 1 inch. It doesn't look, well, it looks like a substantial difference. The math doesn't sound like it would be a substantial difference, you know, but when you visually look at it, you can see that this material is quite a bit thicker. Like, this is decking material. You can walk on this stuff. This is fence material, and it probably wouldn't hold up to a baseball getting thrown through it. Aside from thickness, though, there's another issue, which is the part of the tree that this material is actually taken from. So this is another piece of 5/8 picket that I've got here. Let's get into some tree science real quick. So trees actually grow from the outside in. Here's your pith, is what it's called. That's the center of the tree. Every year, that tree adds a very loose but thick layer of material. That's your bark. And it adds this, it's like a winter coat. It adds this super thick layer of material to protect the material that's already established. And then the next year, it adds another winter coat, and it compresses this first layer, or the previous layer, into the rings before. So as the tree gets older, these rings get tighter and tighter and tighter. So you have pith, heartwood, sapwood. And you can see that on your end grain. So you can see that this heartwood probably stops right here. This is all going to be new growth. But counting up the rings on that, you can tell that this is an old tree, right? If you actually take that ring and you draw a full circle around it, you can get a pretty good idea of how big that tree actually is. So this piece is 5.5 inches wide, and it probably comes from a 4-foot tree, 3 or 4 foot tree, easy. That piece is cut from probably right here on a really big tree, right? There's my pith somewhere up here, but my growth rings just keep going and going and going. Drop my Sharpie. Anyways, old growth versus new growth. New growth is going to be out here. Very loose material layers, and they're, on a new growth tree, that outer layer is going to be pretty close to the pith, versus an old growth where that pith is theoretically, at least 2 feet away from the 2 foot radius away from the outside of the tree. So not just material thickness, it's not the only thing that we're talking about here, but also the part of the tree that it's cut from. What I see a lot with pickets, new material, is that they're harvested from a tree that's, barely big enough to get maybe 3 of these out of them. And the lumber industry is so upside down right now that they're cutting down saplings to make a 2x4. That's part of the problem with pickets. So in terms of cost, if you're bidding jobs like this 5-quarter decking is substantially more expensive. But if your customers wanted the cheap guy, they would have hired him last May. They don't. They want better quality, and they quite frankly deserve it. So this picket is actually old growth. You can see that these rings are pretty tight, and there's a lot of them, right? This tree is probably a couple 100 years old. But the material, the part of the tree that they're using for pickets is from the new growth. This is bark. This is not washed out. This is the outside edge of the tree. There's actually literally still bark on it. So yeah, it's an old tree, and those growth rings are pretty tight, but you're still getting the bark of the tree. That's a picket, versus old growth cedar, dimensional lumber that is a true 5-quarter and is cut from a nice chunk of the tree. So you're getting that heartwood, you're getting the dense grain and all the stability that comes with it. This is actually pretty standard for picket material. You can imagine that there's a pith right about here, right? And like that, there is no hardwood. There's 6 layers of sapwood. So they probably got 8 pickets out of that tree. 1, 2, 3 would be the center, 4, 5, 6, and then some hamster shavings off whatever's left. So not just dimension, that's not the only issue here. When we're talking about ways to build a horizontal fence, we're not just looking at dimension. Obviously this 5-quarter is going to be a little bit beefier, but we're not just talking about that. We're talking about the part of the tree that it comes from, as well as the age of the tree that it comes from. So I think that covers it for picket versus 5-quarter. The other issue that you can have with lumber sometimes, I'll talk about this later, is a bad mill. When they run it through their mill or their planer or whatever, sometimes you get a kick out right here where that mill blade dips in and kicks it out on the other side. This 5/4 is honestly pretty clean. I didn't really notice that on a lot of the material, but that is a pretty common defect. I'll come back to that later. So let's start over here. There's a few different, when you're doing horizontal fence, there's a few different layout conditions, I guess. This back fence is obviously on fairly flat ground. It's not necessarily level. I did have to rip a few pieces on either end just to make it mesh. But on flat ground, my goal is to keep that top flat all the way across. The other side over there obviously has some grade issues where you're gonna start stair stepping, right? So when I'm doing layout, I'm installing from the bottom up, but I'm doing my math from the top down. So in other words, I'm planning my layout to be at 72 inches on the top, right? And then put my mark on the bottom of the post and work my way up. Don't do it the other way around, because if you have to rip material, you're going to end up with a rip cut on the top versus having it buried in the ground. So these rip cuts are obviously intentional. This is the pattern that they wanted to go with. So I've got to calculate my spacing, which is 1/4 inch, plus the width of each rip cut, and work my way from the top down, but then install it from the bottom up. So on a quick side note, this is 1 3/4 is what this piece is ripped at. And the only way that I would feel comfortable installing something like that with a gap in it is with 5/4 material. There's no way that a 5/8 inch picket could hold up, rip that thin. It's going to look like a wet noodle within a year. But obviously you can see that this 5/4 decking is pretty stable material. So that covers layout and material I'm using. So obviously I've got some exposed end grain on just the end of the gate, but overall I like to trim out every face of anything that's normally exposed. So all this is going to be trimmed out all the way around. So a couple notes on lumber selection. Actually, I try to keep what I consider less attractive boards on the bottom. It's all really nice material, but I try to put the uglier stuff on the bottom. I've got a pretty big knot right there. Overall, that's a nice looking piece, but pretty knotty. No pun intended. Everything up here is pretty clean though, pretty clear. For rip cuts, I'm actually intentionally selecting, like this piece is very straight grain, very few knots, and very stable. So I intentionally picked those pieces out of the pile specifically for those rip cuts. Same thing here. So that's going to be very straight grain, very few knots. They're just going to be more stable pieces in the long run. So I've told you that I use 6 foot on center and the material that I use, but that doesn't mean that you can just buy all that material and just slap up a fence, you know. Be intentional about it. If you got 13 boards in a row, which board goes where? You know, I got to make some rip cuts in here, and I anticipate that. So same thing on this section. Very straight grain, very clear, all the way across. Be intentional about those cuts and the placement of your lumber. If I got to make a cut that's 1 3/4 inches, I don't want to cut it out of that material. You know, it's going to warp within a year. So another thing that I'm actually pretty anal about is keeping my large knots, anything that would have some exposure on the end of that knot, I'm pretty intentional about keeping them down, just so they don't have a water pocket. That's facing down, that's facing down. This one's facing up, but I don't see anything that would actually collect water at the top of it. So pretty intentional about that. Just, I don't want water and ice sitting on top of those knots. And if you run down the top of these, you're gonna see, so here's a good example. Top of this one is pretty clean, right? But coming down the bottom, I have 1, 2, that one's definitely pretty exposed. 3, right? Same thing here. Clean on the top. And then on the bottom, I've got 1, 2. And you can see that pretty much all the way around. So yeah, pick out that piece for that place, but even the way that you orient it matters. So this is the flat side of the yard, level across. We've got a step down here because they're going to do some landscaping, bushes, stuff like that, and they kind of wanted it as an accent piece right there. So this side is obviously kind of a different animal. I've got pretty steep slope from the top there. Tapers down here, but it's actually still deceptively sloped. I did end up with an extra step here that I did not anticipate. So when you look at the trim, that's actually the narrowest piece of trim over there. But I tried to make it kind of flow with the system where the step matches that narrow piece of trim. Does that make sense? So I have 1, 2, 3 that are flat, 1 section that's stepped, 1, 2 that are flat, larger, 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 1, 2 that are flat. So I think it flows pretty well. It is tricky to do though. And same thing here, when you're pulling your layout, you're working from the top down. So you've really got to get a good feel for your grade. I'm gonna pause it again. I'm gonna move back so you can see a different angle. So from this angle, you can see that the fence layout actually almost mirrors perfectly the elevation change on the brick. We are going to replace those vinyl panels at some point this year. She's going to do some concrete work out here as well, but so that'll come after that. But when you're looking at that, it's kind of a cool angle right there. You can see that the whole system flows with the shape of the yard. So it's cohesive and it's not accidental. Like you've actually got to pull some measurements and use a string line and a level in order to figure that stuff out. So that's it in terms of layout, I think. Let's talk about weird cuts. I didn't have many on this job. It was all pretty straightforward. This is not a weird cut in my book, but it is an extra step that I think just looks a little cleaner, looks a little more finished, a little more intentional. Is just notching out the bottom of those pickets to match the step down of the brick. A lot of guys would just throw up a full picket here and, you know, cover that piece of brick, call it a day. Just take the 2 seconds to notch that out. This one is actually the weirdest cut that I did, and I eyeballed it. Not bad for eyeballing it, but that was the real killer right there, is getting around that flashing. I want it to sit level, and I want it to sit tight to the end of the fence. Most guys would not notch that out, and if they did, they're not gonna do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cuts on it. They're just gonna chop that whole piece out and staple it up there. I kind of got a kick out of it as I did it, though. I was like, this is ridiculous, but totally justified. Not much else for weird cuts. I've done tutorial videos on splicing cap rail. That should be a no-brainer. Just do it. There's no reason to do a butt splice up there. Just do a nice 25-degree splice. I think those are the only other weird cuts that I've got is on these gates up here. Just to make that hinge sit flat. Nothing crazy, nothing like some of my decks, but worth the extra effort, guys. They're simple cuts, just a couple jigsaw cuts, and cut it twice if you need to. That one, like I said, I eyeballed it, and I ended up cutting it 2 or 3 times just to make it fit where I wanted. Took me 5 minutes. Just do the work, you know. It's really not that complicated, especially if someone's willing to wait for you for 10 months. By the time you get here, they deserve a decent cut. And in case any of you noticed, there is a gap up here, which I did intentionally so that it's not collecting snow. They deserve that, you know. Even if they only waited a week, they still deserve that. They're paying your bills, man. So do the work, do quality work, be intentional about it, and don't be afraid to tell your customer. I actually won't install horizontal fencing with 5/8 material. I turn those jobs down. So, you know, I'll send them a bid for a horizontal fence, and they say, wow, it's 3 times more expensive than the other guy. That's because I don't install 5/8 material for that style, and no exceptions. So don't be afraid to stick to your guns on that. You know, don't feel obligated to take on a job with build specs that you know are not going to last. Like, you know that 5/8 material is not going to hold up, and you're not obligated to take that job. Let someone else do it and spend your time doing something that you can be proud of, that you can put in your portfolio. So I think that covers it, guys. Final note, so earlier when I said I'm pulling my measurements top down but working from the bottom up, the reason for that is so that when I do have these rip cuts, right, and you can see a few of them in there, they all end up at the bottom of the fence, and the top of the fence is going to be full width, sorry, and, you know, spaced correctly. So that's the purpose for that. Alright, guys, thanks for watching. Drop a comment if you have any questions, and God bless. Take care.